and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Our guest is a leading so-called neoconservative. He has sometimes been called the Prince of Darkness. Why? Because of his influence behind the scenes in Washington during the Reagan administration when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense, and especially under the presidency of George W. Bush when he, with others, pushed hard for an invasion of Iraq after the 9/11 attacks. He is currently a resident fellow, I should say, at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, from where he joins us via satellite. Mr. Perle, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Perle, in recent days, we've seen terrorist attacks in Paris, a deadly shootout in Belgium, arrests in Germany, all related to terrorists. This begs the question, is Europe under attack or under major terrorist threats right now?
Well, the whole Western world, Western civilization is under attack by an intense ideology, and we must recognize that it's an ideology aimed at establishing the domination of a radical form of Islam. So it affects the United States, it affects every country in Europe, it affects Africa, and it will go on until the Western world is able to deal enough of a blow, enough of a defeat to this ideology so that it loses its appeal.
Would you say that what happened in Paris was France's 9/11 in a way?
Well, it certainly was terror on a scale that France had not experienced, just as 9/11 was on a scale that the United States had never experienced. My French friends are all calling it a wake-up call, which was the cliche often applied to 9/11. It remains to be seen whether, after the outpouring of emotion, which has been impressive, there will be concrete measures aimed at protecting against similar attacks in the future, because the perpetrators of these attacks have not given up. On the contrary, they are as dedicated as ever to achieving their objectives.
The French authorities, you must have noticed, because you know France well, are now using the expression, quote-unquote, war against terrorism, war against jihadism. We obviously remember that the expression was used by George W. Bush soon after the 9/11 attacks, and this was roundly criticized in Europe. What's your reaction to hearing François Hollande or Manuel Valls here talk about a war against terrorism?
Well, sometimes, unfortunately, we are more likely to learn from our own experience than from the experience of others. The phrase war against terror arose in the aftermath of 9/11, partly because we were stunned and didn't quite know what to call it. It is, in fact, a war against jihadism, against radical Islam. And I think that's the best way to describe it, because terrorism itself is a technique used by radical Islamists. And until we understand who is perpetrating these crimes, we will not design strategies to deal with it effectively.
After 9/11, the strategy, the one you pushed hard for, was the invasion of Iraq, and many people are saying that this is probably the reason, or one of the reasons, we see so much chaos, and this chaos coming back to bite the Western world through these terrorist attacks.
Well, of course, there were terrorist attacks before 9/11, before the invasion of Iraq. And in fact, one of the reasons for 9/11 was the failure of the United States and others to respond to the terror attacks that preceded it. We knew bin Laden was in Afghanistan. We knew he had carried out terrorist attacks and was planning others. But there was not an adequate response. And so the terrorists were emboldened by the fact that they got away with these attacks. The invasion of Iraq was conducted under the misapprehension, now well understood, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. And after September 11, the thing that troubled American authorities and others the most was the possibility that the next attack would be on a much grander scale, because it would involve chemical or biological weapons or nuclear materials. And that remains to this day what should be the principal concern of Western security forces everywhere.
But would you
Because
agree?
the people who carried out the attacks...
I'm sorry, would you agree in retrospect that the invasion of Iraq has created a lot of chaos, starting with Iraq, and this is where many of those terrorists we see today get their training or their inspiration from?
Well, it's certainly clear that the war in Iraq, which went on much longer than it should have, has made that of an unstable area with respect to terrorism. There's no question about that. But I think it's a mistake to attribute this movement to create a caliphate, to force the world to submit to what some radical Islamists understand to be God's will, the will of Allah. It's a mistake to attribute that to Iraq, because if we do that, we won't understand what we're really up against. Without Iraq, we would have faced this anyway, and we face it now whether we like it or not.
Is it a more dangerous threat than Al-Qaeda was on 9/11?
Yes, in many ways it is a more dangerous threat, because you now have many thousands of people around the world inspired by what they observe. And what they observe is the rise of this radical fundamentalist ideology expressed by ISIS fighting in Syria and Iraq. And they appear to have won victories. What the West must now do is make sure that there are no more victories for ISIS, that ISIS is so roundly and thoroughly defeated that those who are inspired by ISIS stop being recruited and return to a normal way of life.
How do you do this? Do you send, again, American and allied troops on the ground in Iraq, because just bombing from the sky is not going to do it?
I agree with you. Bombing from the sky is not going to do it, and the Iraqi security forces appear to be incapable of doing it by themselves. So the answer is, if we were serious about this, we would organize an appropriate coalition of countries whose interests are threatened by the rise of ISIS, and we would take them on in Iraq and in Syria. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be the resolve to do that.
Is President Obama shying from those responsibilities? We've heard Senator John McCain criticize him roundly for not going into Syria. Actually, the French president saying he regretted that there was no bombing of Syria back in August of 2013. Is Obama not up to the task when it comes to dealing with this threat?
No, he's clearly not up to the task. We should have acted in Syria at the very beginning by working with moderate forces. What has now happened is that when we stood aside, others didn't, and a great deal of support, money, weapons, diplomatic and psychological support went to radical Islamists
in Syria. Is it too late
and
now?
We now see the result.
Is it too late?
Well, it's never too late. If ISIS achieves what can be considered a victory, there will be hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions inspired by the appearance of a victory, and the problem we now face will be greatly increased. So it is vital that ISIS not succeed, and if that means we now have to do more than we were prepared to do before, that's the right way forward.
How many U.S. troops do you think would be needed to deal with that situation on the ground?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I do not conceive of American troops substituting for the troops of others, but rather in a leadership role, not a training role. That takes a very long time, and we don't have a very long time. But well-trained modern troops with high-quality communications, intelligence, and so forth are essential alongside Iraqi troops and the more moderate of those who are prepared to fight in Syria. That means a much bigger commitment than has been made so far. It should begin with the United States, but France, Britain, Germany, others must recognize how serious this threat is if ISIS achieves an inspiring victory, even if it's not a real victory, if it's just the appearance of a victory.
Very quickly, President Obama did not attend this Paris march against terrorism. The White House said he should have. Is this just a mere blunder, or does it tell more about President Obama than just a simple mistake?
Well, it was both a mistake and a revealing mistake. What it shows is that the president's instinct, which should have been to express solidarity with those who marched in Paris, was absent. The mistake was a political calculation, but what's more fundamental is the failure to understand how important it is to express solidarity in a crisis like this.
Richard Perle, thank you very much for being with us from Washington, and thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.